So
I don't want to stand in front of you.
What else do you want me to say?
That's good.
Okay.
I loved it that if you're there Wednesday night, Tim, like you walked around and I feel like we're lopsided, like everybody's sitting on this side. That's all right. I can deal with it if you can. But Tim's walking around. He knows every single vendor of wine and beer, as he should. He's getting free stuff handed to him left and right. He got us free pizza at the end of the night from Pizza Coop, which, you want to be around Tim when you're at an event like that. And then last minute, switch to the announcement on Wooden Elementary. We're planning to be at Wooden next week, but Solomon and I were talking earlier, because they're on summer break and we're having difficulty making sure that they have somebody there on site who can give us access, we might be doing the project here. So we'll still have a project to do. We'll still have great work to do to serve them, but it may be here. So look for an email and watch the newsletter this week, all right? But otherwise, we're planning to be there unless we otherwise tell you. All right, think for a moment about the greatest transgression or offense in your life that you've committed that you've been forgiven for. All right, another way to say that is what's the worst thing you've ever done that another person has forgiven you for? I'm not talking about what's God forgiven you for, but what has another person forgiven you for? Most of you know my story. I won't tell the whole thing. I was a cocaine dealer in Charleston, South Carolina from the ages of 16 to 18. But the sad thing about that is selling cocaine was not even close to the worst thing I did during those years. I remember one time, one of the guys I worked with, he hated his brother-in-law. And so one of the ways that he thought he would hurt his brother-in-law was to break into his house and steal some stuff from him. I drove the getaway car for that event, which is something I'm not proud of. Several years ago, I was watching a documentary with my daughter Gracie on Pablo Escobar, and we got all of our cocaine. Everybody got their cocaine in the late 80s from Pablo Escobar. And as I was watching that documentary, just a fresh wave of guilt and shame and fear and regret washed over me. It was like I was back there all over again. There are two very regrettable seasons in my life. The years I was in Charleston and the years in my late 30s and early 40s that I spent addicted to pain medication. If you look at the Old Testament prophet Joel, in Joel 2, he talks about several different kinds of locusts that destroy years of our life. There's the hopping locust and the cutting locust and the stripping locust. Well, the years that I was in Charleston and the years that I was addicted to pain medication are the years that the locust destroyed in my life. But if you read Joel 2, God says, I'll restore to you the years the locusts have eaten. So I'm thankful for that because I don't deserve the forgiveness that I've received in my life. Not at all. I did the worst things I ever did when I was in Charleston, and I hurt the people I loved the most when I was addicted to pain medication, and I don't deserve the forgiveness that was extended to me. My failures and that forgiveness have taught me more about mercy and grace and redemption than all that I learned in college and seminary about the Bible and theology combined. So think about it. When you think of the worst things that you've been forgiven for, how did it make you feel to be forgiven? Was it life-giving, right? Was it humbling? Was it both life-giving and humbling? Did it feel like the weight of the world was taken off your shoulders, not to have to carry the weight of that shame or regret and failure any longer? Were you able to fully receive that forgiveness? Sometimes we're forgiven and we know that we're forgiven intellectually, but we don't receive it. And so we miss out on all the benefits of that forgiveness because we don't embrace it. So now let's look at it from a different angle, from the other side. What's the greatest offense or indignity you suffered at the hands of another person that you've forgiven them for? And how did forgiving them, what's the greatest offense or indignity you've suffered at the hands of another person? And how does that measure up to the greatest thing that you've done that you've been forgiven for? Was it greater? Was it less than? Does it matter if it was greater or less than? And were you able to forgive or not? The question for us today is this: are we really, are we willing to forgive others as much as we've been forgiven? Think again of the worst thing you've ever done, whether you've been forgiven it or not. Maybe nobody else knows about it except for you. Maybe it's the kind of thing nobody else can forgive you for except for God. And here's the good news: He does. Jesus not only can forgive you for whatever that is, He does forgive you no matter how terrible the offense is, no matter how horrible you've determined yourself to be. He forgives. And no doubt, even in a group this large, somebody in here is carrying the weight of some past action, and it is destroying your soul to carry it around with you and to live with the shame and the regret and the remorse that you're carrying. You don't have to carry it anymore. Doesn't matter what you've done, you don't have to carry it. Doesn't matter how immense the offense was, you don't have to carry it anymore. You can experience the forgiveness of Jesus, and that guilt and shame and regret can be wiped away in an instant. In an instant. When we fully understand what Jesus has done for us, it sets us free. And here's what Jesus does. His forgiveness covers everything that we have ever done and will ever do, and it establishes us as completely innocent and totally blameless. No matter what it is that we've done, no matter what anybody else thinks or says, we are blameless and innocent. Jesus said in John 8:36, so if the Son sets you free, you are free indeed, and you are free forever. And when we understand forgiveness and we receive that forgiveness, we will be people who are willing to forgive others for every sin that we incur, every offense that we incur. So Matthew 18:21, Peter comes to Jesus and he says, Lord, how often should I forgive someone who sins against me? 7 times? Pursuing reconciliation and forgiving people is something we're called to do as followers of Jesus. In Romans 12:18, Paul says, do all that you can to live in peace with everyone. So we're called to forgive and to pursue reconciliation. But Peter asks this question, how many times do I have to forgive? Is 7 enough? Because Peter understands that pursuing reconciliation and forgiving people is not easy to do. It requires us to be transparent and humble, and it's risky to be transparent and humble with people who've hurt us. It can make us feel very vulnerable to be transparent and humble, which is why we don't always deal with the pain that other people have caused us, at least not with them always. So Peter being Peter, he wants to know just exactly how many times does he have to make himself vulnerable enough to forgive and pursue reconciliation with those who've hurt him. One theologian, I don't know who said this, but he said, we owe a lot to the fact that Peter was quick to speak before he thought about what he was saying. And I love that about Peter because I do that. My family says that to me all the time. Dad, we don't know if you're really saying what you mean or if you're just thinking, because I talk to think, and it's not always awesome. Doesn't always work out well for me. And so when Peter here, when he says, is forgiving somebody 7 times enough, he thinks Jesus is going to be really impressed by the fact that he's making this magnanimous gesture, right? But Peter's question lacks humility. It lacks the humility necessary to have real reconciliation. So Peter's sure that people are going to sin against him, but he's not as sure that he's going to sin against other people. And we all know that Peter sometimes did the wrong thing, right? And Peter, he expects Jesus to be okay with his desire to limit and measure the amount of times he forgives somebody. And it's not 100% on Peter, because there were actually limits to forgiveness in the religious culture that Peter lived in. There were rabbis who taught that it was absolutely okay to measure and limit the amount of times you forgave somebody. They taught that you only had to forgive 3 times, and then you didn't have to forgive anymore. If you forgive somebody 3 times, you could hold a grudge against them for the rest of their life. Rabbi Jos ben Huda, he said this: if a man commits an offense once, they forgive him. If he commits an offense a second time, they forgive him. If he commits an offense a third time, they forgive him. The fourth time, they do not forgive. They took this directly from the Old Testament prophet Amos. There are 3 or 4 times in Amos 1 where it says something like this: for 3 transgressions of Damascus, and for 4, I will not revoke the punishment. So based on Amos 1, the belief was that God only extends forgiveness to people 3 times, and then that's it. And based on that, we understand why Peter thinks he's being a pretty solid citizen by doubling the amount of times the rabbi said you had to forgive, and then adding one for good measure. But he doesn't get the attaboy from Jesus that he's expecting. Jesus, if I forgive 7 times, is that okay? Jesus is like, no, you have to forgive 70 times 7. And Jesus isn't saying that we should count the number of times we forgive somebody until we get to 490, and then we don't have to forgive them anymore. Oh my gosh, our marriages wouldn't survive the process alone, let alone what happens when we get to 490 in a couple of days. Jesus is saying there's no limit. There's no limit to the number of times that we must forgive each other. 1 John says that as followers of Jesus, we're identified by the people around us by our love. And if we don't forgive, if we measure and limit and quantify our forgiveness, people are going to see us far more by our judgment than by our love. 1 Corinthians 13, 4 and 5. This is a passage that gets read at weddings all the time. And it's not really meant for weddings. It works for weddings and marriages, but it's for all of us. It says, love is patient and kind. Love is not jealous or boastful or proud or rude. It does not demand its own way. It's not irritable, and it keeps no record of being wronged. How are we doing with that? How are we doing with keeping a record of those who've wronged us? Whose record of wrongs might we be keeping even as we sit here? When we keep score, when we keep a record of the offenses we commit against each other, we foster a culture of judgment and condemnation. There's just no way around that. But on the flip side, when we establish a culture of love and forgiveness, then we bring out the best of one another, and we foster a culture of reconciliation and freedom. And to show the power of forgiveness, Jesus tells this parable. Starting in Matthew 18, verse 23, he says, therefore, the kingdom of heaven can be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his servants. In the process, one of his debtors was brought in who owed 10,000 talents. He couldn't pay, so his master ordered that he be sold along with his wife, his children, and everything he owned to pay the debt. But the man fell down before his master and begged him, please be patient with me, and I will pay it all. Then his master was filled with pity for him, and he released him, and he forgave the debt. But when the man left the king, he went to a fellow servant who owed him 100 denarii. He grabbed him by the throat and demanded instant payment. His fellow servant fell down before him and begged for a little more time. Be patient with me and I will pay it, he pleaded. But his creditor couldn't wait. He had the man arrested and put in prison until the debt could be paid in full. When some of the other servants saw this, they were very upset. They went to the king and told him everything that had happened. Then the king called in the man he had forgiven and said, you evil servant, I forgave you that tremendous debt because you pleaded with me. Shouldn't you have mercy on your fellow servant just as I had mercy on you? Then the angry king sent the man to prison to be tortured until he had paid his entire debt. Then Jesus turns and says, that's what my heavenly Father will do to you if you refuse to forgive your brothers and sisters from your heart. So let's see what this means. 10,000 talents was a lot. 10,000 talents that the unforgiving servant owed the king is the equivalent of over $20 million in today's money. And in that culture, one talent alone was worth 15 years of wages. So the total revenue of the province that Peter lived in, that Jesus lived in, Judea and Samaria, was about 600 talents per year. That was a total revenue from all the people who lived in that province. It's only 5% of what this guy owed the king. And so there's a prevailing thought amongst many theologians that this guy didn't just owe the king that much, he had embezzled from the king that much, which would have made this guy the original Bernie Madoff, by the way. And it wasn't until the king's accountants, audited the books and, looked at what everybody owed that they recognized that this guy owed the king this ridiculous amount of money. And because he couldn't pay, nobody could pay that debt. He's going to be thrown into prison, into debtor's prison. I've never understood the concept of debtor's prison, right? You owe money that you can't pay. So what do? You're thrown into prison until you can pay the debt. But you can't work to pay it off, so you're in prison for the rest of your life. I don't understand, but that's just how it is. And it wasn't just the servant that was going to prison. It was his entire family that would be thrown into prison. At least he wouldn't be alone, though, right? I can't imagine that his relationship with his wife would be very warm and fuzzy since it was his debt that got him all thrown in prison in the first place. So at the prospect of being thrown in prison, this guy throws himself at the king's feet and pleads not for mercy, but for patience. He tries anyway to convince the king that he's good for it. He can pay the king back. Apparently he believes he's savvy enough, he's smart enough to figure something out, but it would have taken him 15,000 years to pay the king back. The king is aware, if in fact he did embezzle the money, the king's aware that that's the case. The king is also aware that the servant pleaded for patience, not for mercy, and that he hasn't shown any remorse for his debt. But that doesn't stop the king from having this overwhelming compassion and showing this guy incredible mercy by forgiving his debt. Can you imagine being forgiven a debt like that? Just think about it. Think about, having, tens of thousands of dollars in school debt and somebody just forgives it. Think of somebody coming to you and saying, I'm going to pay your mortgage off, or I'm going to pay off your credit cards if you've got a lot of credit card debt. I mean, that would be life-changing for people. It just change your whole outlook on life. It'd give you peace of mind. The king's mercy and compassion are not only overwhelming, they're unheard of among wealthy people, right? Arnie and I don't know where he went, but Arnie and I were talking about this the other day, just how rare it is to find uber wealthy people who are gracious. And, you just don't see that very often. So even wealthy people who don't need the money don't forgive their greatest debtors, especially if those debtors might have been stealing from them. For many wealthy people who have all they could ever need and want, their goal then becomes just having more than others. I know this. I've talked to people who've told me that. That's what they're trying to do. You can't have more than others if you go around forgiving $20 million debts. This king was an unusual individual, was a unique individual. He was an extraordinarily merciful and compassionate man of wealth. He absorbed the debt of this servant so that this servant and his family could be free, and so that they could be free to live their lives, which they wouldn't have been able to do in prison. And that's exactly what Jesus has done for you and me on the cross. He absorbed our debt. He absorbed the debt of our sin. Jesus took on every sin you and I have ever committed and every sin we will ever commit on the cross. He made those sins his. They're no longer ours when we put our faith in Jesus. They belong to him, and then he paid the massive debt for our sin with his life. Jesus is that unique and compassionate king that shows incredible mercy and compassion towards you and toward me. He loves you like you've never been loved before, with a love that's unlike a love you've ever experienced in your life. When you put your faith in Jesus, you can be absolutely certain that you are no longer guilty for your sin, for anything you've ever done, for anything you will ever do. That is both amazing grace and life-changing grace at the same time. Our sin, it's a debt we couldn't pay off in 10,000 lifetimes if we tried, and yet the mercy of Jesus is free to us. We don't have to jump through a bunch of religious hoops to get his mercy. We don't have to become religious to receive it. All we need to do is acknowledge the immensity of our debt and put our faith in the fact that Jesus is the only one that can forgive, that he's the only way, that life and hope and everything we need is found in him. And when we receive that, we're free. We are free. That should have been, and when we receive that, it should make us forgiving people. That should have been the case with this servant who's forgiven this enormous debt, we would have expected this guy to become the most forgiving person that Palestine has ever known, right? What could anybody possibly do to this guy who's been forgiven such an enormous debt that he could not now forgive, given the fact that he's forgiven so much? But tragically with this guy, the opposite happens. Instead of being the most gracious and forgiving person in all of Palestine, he becomes maybe the cruelest, most unforgiving and merciless person in all of Palestine. Instead of acting like a man that's been set free, he's still acting like a man who owes a debt it would take 15,000 years to pay, and he's still stressed by that. He acts like he's still carrying the stress of that debt. He seeks out a fellow servant, one of his friends, who owes him 100 denarii, and before anybody can say a word, the guy, the unforgiving debtor, grabs the guy by the throat and demands instant payment. A.R.S. Kennedy is a theologian. He compared the two debts this way. He says, by the way, a single denarius was 1 day's wage. So this guy owed the unforgiving servant about 3 months' worth of wages, where the unforgiving servant owed the king 15,000 years of wages. So that's the difference. So then A.R.S. Kennedy says, the 100 denarii debt could be carried in one pocket. The 10,000 talent debt would take an army of about 8,600 carriers to carry it, each carrying a sack of coins 60 pounds in weight. And they would form at a distance of a yard apart a line 5 miles long. The contrast between the debts is staggering. So ironically, the man being choked behaves exactly like the unforgiving servant behaved before the king. He falls down at his feet and he begs for patience. Instead of having a flashback to being forgiven an enormous debt by the king, the unforgiving servant demands justice. He wants his money. He demands payment. And instead of showing mercy like he'd been shown mercy, he has his friend thrown into prison. And the unforgiving servant, he had the legal right to pursue justice, but given the fact that he'd been forgiven so much, he didn't have the moral right to pursue justice and have his friend thrown in prison. And by behaving the way that he did, the unforgiving debtor puts himself in a type of emotional prison. Warren Wiersbe says, the world's worst prison is the prison of an unforgiving heart. If we refuse to forgive others, then we are only imprisoning ourselves and causing our own torment. So if you've held a grudge against somebody, if you've really held a resentment for a long time, you know, regardless of what we say to each other, we pay the price. And we pay the greatest price for holding that resentment and not extending forgiveness. So some of the other servants see what happened here. They're so upset by the actions of the unforgiving servant that they go and tell the king. They recognize the total hypocrisy in his actions. They recognize his lack of compassion. And they tell the king, and the king is just as upset as they are, and he responds with shock. He's shocked that this guy behaved that way, and he's furious with him. The king says, you evil servant, I forgave you that tremendous debt because you pleaded with me. Shouldn't you have mercy on your fellow servant, just as I had mercy on you? Then the angry king sent the man to prison to be tortured until he had paid his entire debt, which he wasn't going to be able to do. So then Jesus turns to those listening and he says this, that's what my Father and my Heavenly Father will do to you if you refuse to forgive your brothers and sisters from your heart. Now, Jesus isn't saying if you hold a grudge against somebody, you're going to hell. That's not what this is about. This isn't about salvation. It's about our relationship. He's saying if you refuse to forgive people who've wronged you, then you're not going to experience the full blessing, if any of the blessing of being forgiven. You're not going to experience the freedoms associated with being forgiven the enormous debt that Jesus has forgiven you for. It's impossible for us to experience the benefits and freedom of forgiveness when we hold resentments and are unwilling to forgive other people. In the recovery community, like Alcoholics Anonymous, they focus a great deal of time, attention, and energy on doing the work necessary to forgive other people and to release the resentments that we hold towards others. They've proven that people in recovery are far less likely to relapse when they don't hold resentments towards other people. And they put just as much time and energy into forgiving other people, into making or seeking forgiveness, into making amends, because it's been proven that people in recovery are far less likely to relapse when they're not holding the weight of guilt and shame for what they've done. The same principles apply to everybody in this room, whether we're in the recovery community or not. If we don't forgive, we pay the price. I experienced a very difficult betrayal by somebody I considered a really good friend several years ago. And that betrayal was not only painful for me, it cost my family a great deal, emotionally, relationally, and otherwise. And I'd love to tell you that I'm such a super spiritual person and that I'm so Christ-like that I was moved to forgive this person as soon as they hurt me. Not even close. Not even close. I was too busy reliving the betrayal over and over again in my mind and then thinking of all the ways that I could even the score. But all I was doing was punishing myself. I knew, like I'm not stupid, I knew early on that I should forgive this person, but I didn't want to. And even if I had wanted to, if I had said, I forgive that person, it wouldn't have meant anything because I was too busy reliving it. But I did tell God I was willing to forgive. It took me several months to work it out in therapy, and many, many times listening to one Tim Keller sermon on absorbing the offenses of others and forgiving them to get me to a place where I was willing and able and ready to forgive. But I still haven't talked to that friend. I may never talk to that person again. Forgiveness doesn't always lead to reconciliation as much as we wish it would. If the person who has wounded us doesn't acknowledge that they've wounded us, doesn't accept any responsibility for what they've done, it's very difficult to reconcile. If we've been emotionally, physically, or spiritually wounded or abused by somebody that doesn't acknowledge what they've done, it can be dangerous for us to pursue reconciliation. It could put us in a position to be wounded all over again. But having said that, we should always be willing to forgive, and we should pursue reconciliation whenever possible, unless, again, it would put us in a position to be damaged all over again. But even in those situations, we still must forgive. Even where we've been wounded in ways we don't ever want to talk about, we should still forgive, not for the benefit or sake of the other person necessarily, but for ours, and then maybe for theirs. Sometimes forgiveness doesn't always benefit the other person, but it always, always, always benefits us. We forgive each other. We forgive other people because holding resentments eats away at our soul. And often it does nothing to the person that we resent. Forgiving them allows us to move on with our lives. It allows us to be free. It allows us to experience all the benefits and blessings of being forgiven ourselves. And when it comes to the everyday ways that we offend each other, in our relationships, we should always not only forgive, but we should always seek reconciliation in those circumstances. That's what Jesus taught throughout the Gospels. It's what he's getting at in this parable. The reality is some of the most unhappy followers of Jesus are those that hold resentments against one another and don't forgive. And we don't want to be those people. So what Jesus is trying to get us to understand in this parable is just how massive our debt of sin really is, just how much he's forgiven us for. And it's very much like the debt of the unforgiving servant. It's so great we could never hope to repay it. It's so great that we deserve debtor's prison. We deserve eternal separation from God. And the everyday offenses that we commit against each other are nothing compared to the offenses we've committed against God, compared to the offenses God has forgiven us. And if Jesus can forgive us this enormous debt, how can we not forgive each other the smaller debts we incur along the way? If we're a follower of Jesus, again, we have been forgiven. But again, it's one thing to know that we are forgiven. It's a totally different and way better thing to receive that forgiveness. Have you really received the forgiveness that God has offered us, that he offers you? Has it changed your life? Has it changed the way that you deal with other people who hurt you? Are you quick to forgive? Do you look for ways to forgive? Do you look for ways to reconcile? Or do you look for ways to harm that person, to get even with them? And it's very easy to get even with people We can assassinate a person's character in a text, in a post, in a conversation. It's easy to do that. But when we know at the heart level just how guilty we are, how undeserving of God's mercy we are, and yet how loved we are by that God who forgives us so much, it changes everything. It turns us into people who don't hold accounts against each other, who don't keep score, and who are willing to work through difficult issues in order to reconcile and forgive. And we reveal who we are by our willingness to forgive or lack thereof. And none of us is perfect. We're going to hurt each other. We do. I've hurt people in this room. And I also try to figure it out with them as well. And if I haven't, I will. The question is, are we willing to forgive? Are we quick to forgive? Or do we prefer to hold resentments? Do we prefer to make a case? Because we can make a good case. Like, if we've been hurt legitimately, it's easy to make a good case for why we're not forgiving somebody. We might say something like, I'd never do what they did. I'd never do that. And then that's our case. And then we can assassinate that person's character, you know. That's what I said to the person about the person that betrayed me. I'd never do that. And I fueled my resentment off that statement. I would never do that. Until I realized, well, I may not do that exact thing, but I would do worse. I have done worse. And that got me to the place where I was able to forgive, because regardless of how great a case I had against this friend, I'm far more guilty. It's just the truth. I have no right to hold a grudge, to hold resentment toward them. Ephesians 4:32 says, be kind to each other, tenderhearted, forgiving one another, just as God through Christ has forgiven you. Are we living that way? Are we being kind? Are we being tenderhearted? Are we forgiving one another the way that God has forgiven us? Are we experiencing the depth of God's mercy in a fresh way? Or are we holding resentment towards people? Is there somebody who we know we've got a list of grievances against that we may need to forgive? If not for their sake, and it might benefit them, and if it does, that's awesome, but it will definitely benefit you and me to forgive. Who do we need to extend the type of mercy to that God has extended to us? We're going to come to communion here, and we try to make communion about more than just doing it every week. As you come to communion today, come realizing that what we celebrate in communion is Jesus taking our sin, making it his, and paying the price with his life so that we can experience the depth of God's forgiveness, so that our enormous debt of sin is erased. And when we recognize that and really receive it, I don't think there's a way that we can receive it and not be people who are willing to forgive and keep short accounts with each other. Let's pray. Father, help us to do just that. Help us to, as we come to the communion table, to recognize that what you did there was enormous and unheard of and undeserving. We didn't deserve a love so great that you would sacrifice your life for us, especially because we are so guilty. But that's exactly why you did it. Because we are so guilty, because you love us, because there was nothing we could do on our own to be in a relationship with you. You had to do it for us. And because you did, we can experience life in all of its fullness. We can have joy and peace. And we can have relationships where we keep short accounts with one another and forgive quickly. God, help us to not be like Peter's question. Help us not to limit and measure our forgiveness, but help us to forgive as often as it's necessary. We need to be forgiven that much by one another. Help us to forgive one another that way, we pray in Jesus' name.